The stagecoach rattled into Twin Falls, Idaho on a blistering July afternoon in 1882, and Zachary Hawthorne stood waiting at the station with his hat crushed between nervous hands, knowing that the woman stepping down from that coach would become his wife whether they could speak to each other or not. He had placed the advertisement 6 months ago, desperate for companionship on his sprawling cattle ranch that stretched along the Snake River Canyon. The letters had arrived through a marriage broker in San Francisco, written in English by a translator, explaining that Rosa Delgado was 22 years old, from a small village in northern Spain, and seeking a new life in America after her family's vineyard had failed. Zachary was 26, tall and sun-weathered, with dark blonde hair and blue eyes that crinkled at the corners from years of squinting across open rangeland. He had built his ranch from nothing, working as a cattle hand for 8 years before saving enough to purchase his own land. The house was sturdy, the herds were healthy, but the silence in the evenings had grown unbearable. The stagecoach door opened, and a small gloved hand accepted the driver's assistance. Rosa emerged into the Idaho sunshine, and Zachary felt his breath catch. She was petite, barely reaching his shoulder, with glossy black hair pinned beneath a traveling hat and dark eyes that swept across the unfamiliar landscape with equal parts wonder and apprehension. Her dress was simple but well made, dusty from the journey, and she clutched a worn leather bag that appeared to contain everything she owned in this world. Their eyes met across the dusty street, and Zachary stepped forward, his heart hammering. He had practiced what he would say 100 times, but now the words felt clumsy in his mouth. "Miss Delgado, I'm Zachary Hawthorne." Rosa's expression brightened with recognition of her own name, and she moved toward him with careful steps. When she spoke, her voice was melodic and completely incomprehensible. "Señor Hawthorne, estoy muy agradecida de conocer finalmente. El viaje ha sido muy largo." Zachary stared at her, feeling panic rise in his chest. He had known she spoke Spanish, but somehow he had imagined that she would know at least some English, that they would manage basic communication. The reality of their situation crashed over him like a wave. This woman had traveled thousands of miles to marry a man she could not speak with, and he had no idea how to bridge the chasm between them. Rosa seemed to sense his distress, and she offered him a small, tentative smile. She pointed to herself. "Rosa." Then she gestured to him with a questioning look. "Zachary," he said, touching his chest. "You can call me Zach." She repeated it, her accent transforming the simple name into something exotic. Zach-R-E. Then she tried the shortened version. Zach. Her pronunciation was softer, the CH sound slightly different but close enough. He found himself smiling despite his nervousness. "That's right, Zach," he pointed to her. "Rosa." She nodded, and for a moment they simply stood there in the street, a cowboy and a Spanish woman, connected by nothing but necessity and hope. The stagecoach driver cleared his throat and handed down a small trunk, which Zachary hefted onto his shoulder. He gestured toward his wagon, tied up outside the general store, and Rosa followed him with small, graceful steps. The ride out to the ranch took an hour, and they sat side by side on the wagon seat in profound silence. Zachary tried several times to start a conversation, pointing out landmarks and explaining things she could not understand. Rosa listened attentively, her hands folded in her lap, occasionally murmuring responses in Spanish that were equally lost on him. By the time they reached the ranch, frustration and exhaustion had settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. The house stood against the backdrop of the canyon, a 2-story structure built from timber and stone with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze. Zachary had spent the past week cleaning every corner, washing curtains, and filling the kitchen with supplies. He had even picked wildflowers and placed them in a jar on the dining table, though they had wilted in the heat. Rosa stepped down from the wagon and surveyed her new home with wide eyes. She walked slowly toward the porch, touching the railing, looking up at the windows. Then she turned to Zachary and spoke a string of Spanish words that sounded pleased. She was smiling, and that was enough for him. He carried her trunk inside and set it in the bedroom, the room that would now be theirs. The awkwardness of that reality hit them both simultaneously. They were meant to marry in 2 days, once the circuit judge arrived in town. Until then, Zachary had planned to sleep in the barn, giving Rosa the privacy of the house. He tried to explain this through gestures, pointing to himself, then to the barn, making sleeping motions with his hands pressed together against his cheek. Rosa watched his pantomime with confusion, then understanding dawned. She shook her head firmly and launched into what sounded like a lecture in Spanish, gesturing at the house, at him, at the barn. Zachary gathered that she was protesting the arrangement, perhaps finding it improper or unnecessary. He held up his hands in a calming gesture. "It's all right," he said gently, though he knew she could not understand. "I want you to be comfortable. We will marry soon, but until then, the house is yours." She frowned, clearly unhappy with the decision but unable to argue effectively. Finally, she sighed and nodded, a small defeated gesture that made Zachary feel like he had somehow failed his first test as her future husband. That evening, he cooked a simple dinner of beef stew and biscuits, and they sat across from each other at the table, eating in silence. Rosa picked at her food, and Zachary wondered if she found his cooking lacking, or if she was simply overwhelmed by the enormity of the change in her life. When she rose to clear the dishes, he tried to help, but she waved him away with gestures that he interpreted as insistence that she would handle it. He watched her move around his kitchen, learning where things were kept, and felt the strangeness of having another person in his space after so many years alone. Before he left for the barn, Zachary pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. He drew a simple picture of the sun and wrote beneath it, "Sun." Then he pointed outside to where the last rays of daylight were fading. "Sun," he repeated. Rosa looked at the paper, then at him, and comprehension lit her features. She pointed to the drawing and said, "Sol." Zachary wrote that down beneath his word. "Sol," he repeated, mimicking her pronunciation. "Sun, Sol." Rosa's face broke into a radiant smile and she grabbed the pencil from him. She drew the moon and stars. "Luna," she said, pointing to her drawing. "Estrellas." "Moon," Zachary said, writing it down. "Stars." They continued like this until the light grew too dim to see, trading words back and forth, building the first fragile bridge between their worlds. When Zachary finally stood to leave, Rosa walked him to the door. She touched his arm gently and spoke a phrase that needed no translation. "Gracias, Zach." "You are welcome, Rosa," he replied, and meant it with his whole heart. The next morning, Zachary returned to the house at dawn to find Rosa already awake, dressed, and attempting to start a fire in the stove. She had clearly struggled with the American design, which differed from whatever she had used in Spain, and she looked up at him with frustrated tears in her eyes when he entered. He crossed to her immediately, his hands raised in a soothing gesture. "Let me show you," he said softly, even though the words meant nothing to her. He knelt beside the stove and demonstrated slowly, pointing out the damper, the firebox, the way to arrange the kindling. Rosa watched intently, nodding, and when he gestured for her to try, she replicated his movements perfectly. The fire caught, and she clapped her hands together in delight, turning to him with such joy that he could not help but laugh. breakfast was another lesson. Zachary showed her where he kept the coffee, the flour, the eggs from the chickens. Rosa examined everything with intense curiosity, comparing his supplies to what she must have known back home. She attempted to communicate something about bread, gesturing in a kneading motion, and he brought out the sourdough starter he kept in the cool cellar. Her eyes lit up, and she immediately set to work, mixing and kneading with practiced hands while Zachary fried eggs and salt pork. They ate together again, and this time Rosa seemed more relaxed. She attempted words in English, pointing to objects and waiting for him to name them. Table, chair, plate, fork. Zachary repeated each one slowly, and Rosa would say them after him, concentrating fiercely on the unfamiliar sounds. Then she would give him the Spanish words, and he would do his best to repeat them, which often made her giggle at his terrible accent. After breakfast, Zachary needed to work. The cattle did not care about language barriers or new wives, and there were fences to mend in the north pasture. He tried to explain through gestures that he was leaving to work with the cows, and Rosa nodded her understanding. But when he headed toward the barn to saddle his horse, she followed him. He turned, surprised. "Rosa, you do not have to come. The work is hard." She responded in Spanish, her tone determined, and began pointing to things around the barn. She wanted him to teach her. Zachary realized she was not content to sit in the house while he worked. She wanted to learn about the ranch, about his life, about everything. So he began teaching her about the horses, introducing her to his bay gelding named Copper and the gentler mare he kept for occasional visitors. Rosa was hesitant at first, but under his patient guidance, she learned to stroke their noses, to offer them the apple pieces he kept in his pocket. She pointed to the horse and said, "Caballo." "Horse," Zachary replied. "Caballo. Horse." They rode out together, Rosa seated in front of him on Copper because she admitted through gestures that she had never ridden before. The feeling of her small frame pressed against his chest, trusting him completely as they moved across the range eland, stirred something protective and tender in Zachary's heart. He kept one arm securely around her waist while he guided the horse with the other, and he felt her gradually relax into the rhythm of the animal's gait. The Snake River Canyon spread out before them, a dramatic gash in the earth where the river had carved its path through volcanic rock. Rosa gasped at the sight, speaking rapid Spanish that Zachary interpreted as amazement. He stopped the horse at an overlook, and they sat together, looking out over the water far below, the green ribbon of cottonwoods that followed its course, the red-tailed hawk circling on the thermals. "Beautiful," Zachary said, gesturing to the view. "Beautiful." Rosa repeated the word carefully. "Bow tie full." Then she added in Spanish, "Hermoso." "Hermoso," he echoed, and she nodded approvingly. They spent the morning riding the property boundaries, and Zachary showed her the different pastures, the creek that provided water for the cattle, the stand of aspens where he sometimes saw deer in the early morning. At each stop they traded words: tree, arbol, water, agua, cow, vaca, sky, cielo. By the time they returned to the ranch house for lunch, they were both exhausted but pleased. Rosa prepared a simple meal from the ingredients she found in the kitchen, creating something that tasted of Spain, with olive oil and garlic and herbs Zachary did not recognize. It was delicious, and he told her so, making exaggerated gestures of appreciation that made her laugh. That afternoon, while Zachary repaired tack in the barn, Rosa explored the house more thoroughly. She found his books, few though they were, and brought one to him with a questioning expression. He flipped through it, finding a passage that was not too complex, and read aloud to her while he worked. She did not understand the words, but she seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, sitting on a hay bale and listening with her eyes closed. When evening came, Zachary once again prepared to sleep in the barn. But Rosa stopped him at the door, and this time she had a piece of paper. She had drawn a picture of the house with two stick figures, one clearly meant to be him and one her. Then she had drawn the barn with a sad face. She pointed to him, then to the drawing, then to the house, her meaning clear. She wanted him to stay in the house. Zachary shook his head gently. "Rosa, it would not be proper, not until we are married." She did not understand his words, but she understood his refusal. Her face fell, and she spoke urgently in Spanish, gesturing between them. Zachary caught the word esposo and thought it might mean husband. She seemed to be arguing that they would be married soon, that the separation was unnecessary. He struggled to explain through gestures about propriety, about reputation, about wanting to do right by her. Rosa listened, her expression softening, and finally she nodded. But before he left, she took his hand and pressed it to her cheek, a gesture so tender that it made his throat tight. "Gracias," she whispered. "Un hombre bueno." He did not know what she had said, but he felt the warmth of it. "Good night, Rosa," he said quietly, and walked out into the night. The wedding took place 2 days later in the small church in Twin Falls. The circuit judge, a portly man named Henderson, performed the ceremony with the help of an interpreter he had found, a Mexican ranch hand from a neighboring property who spoke both English and Spanish. Rosa wore a simple white dress she had carried in her trunk, and Zachary wore his Sunday best, a black suit he had not worn in 2 years. The ceremony was brief. Rosa repeated her vows in Spanish and Zachary in English, and the interpreter ensured that each understood they were pledging their lives to one another. When Judge Henderson pronounced them man and wife, Zachary turned to Rosa, unsure of what to do. She solved the problem by rising on her toes and kissing his cheek, a soft brush of her lips that sent warmth spreading through his chest. They signed the papers, Rosa's signature flowing and elegant next to his rough scrawl, and then they were married. The interpreter congratulated them and asked if Rosa had any questions. She spoke to him rapidly in Spanish, and the man turned to Zachary with a slight smile. "She wants to know if you are happy," the interpreter said. "She is worried that you might regret this choice because you cannot speak with her." Zachary looked directly at Rosa, holding her dark eyes with his. "Tell her that I am very happy. Tell her that we will learn to speak to each other, and that I will do everything in my power to be a good husband to her." The interpreter translated, and Rosa's face glowed. She responded, and the interpreter said, "She says that she will work hard to learn English and to be a good wife. She says she is grateful for your patience and kindness." They rode back to the ranch as husband and wife, and this time Rosa sat beside Zachary on the wagon seat with her hand tucked into his. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and challenging, but no longer quite so lonely. That night, Zachary did not go to the barn. They prepared for bed in shy silence, changing in separate rooms before meeting again in the bedroom they would now share. Zachary had been with women before, but this felt different, weighted with significance and tenderness. Rosa came to him in a simple white nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked up at him with trust and nervousness in equal measure. He cupped her face gently in his hands and spoke to her, even though he knew she could not understand most of it. "I will be patient," he promised. "I will be gentle. We have all the time in the world, Rosa." She responded in Spanish, her voice soft and earnest, and he thought she was making similar promises. Then she kissed him, and words ceased to matter. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Each morning they woke together, and Zachary would teach Rosa new English words while they prepared breakfast. She was a quick student, absorbing vocabulary with impressive speed, and she insisted he learn Spanish as well. They created lists on paper, whole categories of words: animals, weather, food, emotions. It was the emotions that proved most challenging and most necessary. Rosa would point to her heart and say "Feliz" with a smile, and Zachary would understand, happy. She would furrow her brow and say "Confundida," and he would gather it meant confused. When she was frustrated with her slow progress in English, she would say "frustrada" with such vehemence that the meaning was perfectly clear. Zachary learned to express himself in Spanish too, though his accent was atrocious, and Rosa often had to suppress giggles at his attempts. Tengo hambre meant he was hungry. Estoy cansado meant he was tired. And te aprecio, which Rosa taught him carefully one evening, meant something close to "I appreciate you," though he sensed there were layers to it he did not yet grasp. The ranch work continued, and Rosa became his partner in it. She learned to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, to milk the cow in the morning, to identify which plants in the garden were weeds and which were vegetables. She worked with a determination that impressed Zachary, never complaining even when the work was hard or the Idaho sun beat down mercilessly. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after their marriage, they were working together to repair a section of fence near the river when a rattlesnake emerged from the rocks. Zachary saw it first and grabbed Rosa, pulling her back so quickly that she stumbled. "Snake," he shouted. "Dangerous." Rosa looked down at the coiling rattler, its tail buzzing a warning, and her eyes went wide. "Serpient," she breathed. "Peligroso." Zachary carefully ushered her back while keeping his eyes on the snake, and once they were at a safe distance, he found a long branch and encouraged the creature to move along. When it finally slithered away into the brush, he turned to find Rosa pale and shaking. "It is all right," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You are safe. I will always keep you safe." She clung to him, her face pressed against his chest, and he felt the rapid beating of her heart. When she finally pulled back, she looked up at him with shining eyes and said, "Te quiero, Zach." He did not know those exact words, but the way she said them, the look on her face, made their meaning unmistakable. She was telling him that she loved him. His heart swelled so large in his chest that he thought it might burst. "I love you too, Rosa," he said, framing her face with his hands. "I love you." She understood, even without a translation, and she kissed him there in the middle of the pasture with the sound of the river in the background and the hawks crying overhead. It was a turning point, the moment when their marriage of convenience and necessity transformed into something real and precious. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the sun set over the canyon, and Rosa leaned against Zachary's shoulder. She had brought out their word lists and a pencil, and she wrote carefully in English, "I love you, my husband." Zachary took the pencil and wrote in his rough Spanish, "Te amo, mi esposa." Rosa laughed at his spelling, gently corrected it, and then kissed him again. "We will learn," she said in careful English. "Together we will learn." "Yes," Zachary agreed. "Together." The seasons turned, and with them came new challenges and new vocabulary. When autumn arrived and the temperature dropped, Rosa experienced her first Idaho winter approaching and needed words for cold, snow, frost, and ice. Zachary showed her how to prepare the house for winter, how to stock the root cellar, how to ensure the livestock would survive the harsh months ahead. Rosa proved invaluable during the fall harvest, working alongside Zachary to bring in the hay, to preserve vegetables, to prepare the ranch for the coming cold. Her English improved daily, though she still struggled with complex grammar and often mixed Spanish words into her sentences when she could not remember the English equivalent. Zachary's Spanish was progressing more slowly, but he could now hold simple conversations, and Rosa's delight when he successfully expressed a complete thought made every moment of study worthwhile. In November, the first snow fell. Rosa had never seen snow before, and she ran out into the yard like a child, catching flakes on her tongue and spinning with her arms outstretched. Zachary watched from the porch, his heart full to bursting at the sight of her joy. She called to him in Spanish, urging him to join her, and he did, catching her around the waist and spinning her until they both collapsed laughing into the fresh powder. "Snow is beautiful," Rosa said in English, her accent still thick but her meaning clear. "In Spain, I never see this." "In Spain, you would not freeze your toes off either," Zachary teased, and Rosa laughed, understanding enough to catch his meaning. They went inside and warmed themselves by the fire, drinking hot coffee and wrapped in blankets. Rosa curled against Zachary's side, and he stroked her hair absently while she practiced reading aloud from one of his books. She stumbled over words occasionally, but her progress was remarkable. "You are a good teacher," Rosa said, looking up at him. "Patient and kind, like you promise at the wedding." "You are a good student," Zachary replied, "and a wonderful wife." Rosa blushed at the compliment, and Zachary was once again struck by how much he loved this woman who had arrived on a stagecoach, barely able to communicate, and who had worked so hard to build a life with him. Winter deepened, and they spent long evenings by the fire, talking in their blend of English and Spanish, learning each other's stories. Rosa told him about her childhood in Spain, about her father's vineyard and how a blight had destroyed their crops, about the poverty that had driven her family to desperation. Her brother had gone to Argentina seeking work. Her sister had married a shopkeeper in Madrid. Rosa had chosen America, chosen the unknown, because she believed in new beginnings. Zachary told her about growing up in Missouri, about his parents dying of fever when he was 17, about traveling west alone because there was nothing left for him in the place he had once called home. He told her about the years of hard work, of saving every penny, of the dream of owning land and building something that would last. "We are both looking for home," Rosa said one night, her English now quite serviceable, "and we find it together." "Yes," Zachary agreed, kissing her forehead. "We found it together." Christmas came, and Zachary chopped down a small pine tree from the mountainside, bringing it into the house to Rosa's delight. She had never seen a Christmas tree before, she explained, as the tradition was not common in her village. Together they made decorations from whatever they could find: paper chains, dried orange slices, strings of popcorn. Rosa sang Spanish carols in her clear, sweet voice while they worked, and Zachary joined in clumsily, making her laugh at his pronunciation. On Christmas morning, Zachary gave Rosa a warm woolen shawl he had purchased from the general store on a trip to town. She wrapped it around her shoulders immediately, her eyes bright with pleasure. Rosa gave him a gift that made his throat tight: a scarf she had knitted herself in the evenings when he thought she was simply mending clothes. The stitches were careful and even, and she had used yarn she must have bartered for somehow without his knowledge. "I love it," he said, winding it around his neck despite being inside by the warm fire. "I will treasure it always." "Feliz Navidad, my amor," Rosa said, kissing him softly. "Merry Christmas, my love," Zachary replied. January and February were brutal, with snowstorms that kept them trapped in the house for days at a time. But the forced proximity only brought them closer. They cooked together, read together, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. Rosa's English was now fluent enough for real conversation, though she still had an accent that Zachary found utterly charming. One evening during a particularly fierce blizzard, as they lay in bed listening to the wind howl, Rosa spoke quietly into the darkness. "Zach, I need tell you something." He turned to her, concerned by her serious tone. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "A baby," she said simply. "I am going to have a baby." Zachary's mind went blank with shock, then flooded with joy so intense he could barely breathe. "A baby? Rosa, are you certain?" "Yes," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. "I am certain. In summer, maybe July or August." He pulled her close, overwhelmed with emotion. They were going to be parents. This woman who had come to him as a stranger, who had worked so hard to bridge the gap between them, was carrying his child. "I am so happy," he managed. "Rosa, I am so very happy." "You are not afraid?" she asked softly. "A baby is much work, much responsibility." "I am terrified," Zachary admitted. "But I am happy. We will learn how to be parents just like we learned how to talk to each other. Together." Rosa laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Together," she agreed. The pregnancy changed things in subtle ways. Zachary became even more protective, insisting Rosa not lift heavy things or work too hard. Rosa tolerated this for about a week before she firmly informed him that she was pregnant, not ill, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her work. They compromised, with Rosa doing lighter tasks and Zachary taking on the heavier labor. Spring arrived with a rush of warmth and new growth. The snow melted, revealing the greening grass beneath, and the cattle moved eagerly to the fresh pastures. Rosa's belly grew round, and Zachary found himself constantly amazed by the physical evidence of the life they had created. He would place his hand on her stomach and feel the baby move, and wonder at the miracle of it. In April, they made the journey to Twin Falls to see the doctor, who confirmed that Rosa was healthy and the baby seemed strong. The doctor's wife, a kind woman named Margaret, spoke some Spanish and took Rosa under her wing, explaining what to expect during childbirth and answering her questions. Zachary waited anxiously outside, and when Rosa emerged, she was smiling. "Everything is good," she reassured him. "The doctors say the baby come in late July, maybe early August. He say I am healthy and strong." "Of course you are," Zachary said, helping her into the wagon. "You are the strongest person I know." They stopped at the general store to purchase supplies, and Zachary found himself looking at tiny clothes, little gowns and booties that seemed impossibly small. Rosa joined him, running her fingers over the soft fabrics with a wistful expression. "We should buy some," Zachary said, "for the baby." Rosa looked at him with surprise and pleasure. "You want to? Of course I want to," he replied. "Let us buy everything the baby will need." They spent a small fortune that day, purchasing clothes and blankets and diapers. Rosa selected a wooden cradle that the storekeeper had made, and Zachary loaded it into the wagon with care. The storekeeper's wife, who had been watching them with a gentle smile, gave Rosa a packet of tea. "For after the baby comes," she explained. "It will help with milk production and healing." "And congratulations to you both." Rosa thanked her in English, and they drove home with the wagon full of baby goods, talking excitedly about the future. They discussed names, combining options from both their cultures. For a boy, perhaps Miguel or Santiago, which could be shortened to Mike or Diego for ease in Idaho. For a girl, perhaps Elena or Isabel. "What about Zachariah if it is a boy?" Rosa suggested. After his papa, Zachary shook his head. "One Zachary is enough in any family. What about Raphael?" "That is a good, strong name in both languages." Rosa smiled. "Raphael, I like this. And for a girl, what do you think of Isabella? We can call her Bella for short." "Isabella is perfect," Zachary agreed. Summer arrived, bringing heat that made Rosa uncomfortable in her advanced pregnancy. Zachary rigged a shade on the porch and brought her cool drinks from the spring house. She spent her days sewing tiny clothes, preparing the nursery they had created in the small room off their bedroom, and talking to her belly in a mixture of Spanish and English. "You will be so loved, little one," she would say. "You will have the best papa in all of Idaho, and I will teach you Spanish and English both, so you will never have the troubles your mama and papa had." Zachary would often find her like this, talking to the baby, and his heart would swell with love for both of them. On a sweltering afternoon in early August, Rosa's labor began. Zachary had prepared for this, having arranged for Margaret, the doctor's wife, to come stay with them as the due date approached. Margaret had arrived 3 days earlier, a cheerful woman in her 50s who kept Rosa calm and entertained with stories of her own children. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Zachary paced the house, helpless and terrified every time he heard Rosa cry out in pain. Margaret emerged periodically to reassure him that everything was progressing normally, but the hours dragged on endlessly. Finally, just as the sun was setting on the second day, Zachary heard a new sound, the thin, wavering cry of a newborn baby. He rushed to the bedroom door, and moments later Margaret emerged with a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "You have a son," she said, beaming. "A healthy, strong son. And your wife did beautifully." Zachary took the baby with trembling hands, looking down at the tiny red face, the dark hair, the miniature fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength. His son. His and Rosa's son. The reality of it washed over him, and he felt tears streaming down his face. "Can I see Rosa?" he asked. "Of course," Margaret said. "She is exhausted but well. Go to her." Zachary entered the bedroom to find Rosa propped against pillows, her face pale and drawn but smiling. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and placed their son in her arms. Rosa looked down at the baby with an expression of such pure love that Zachary felt his heart might break from the beauty of it. "Raphael," Rosa whispered. "Our Raphael. Raphael Hawthorne," Zachary said. "He is perfect, Rosa. And you are amazing. I have never been so proud of anyone in my entire life." Rosa leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat together, the three of them, as the last light of day faded from the window and the stars emerged overhead. Everything they had worked for, everything they had struggled to build, had led to this moment. Margaret stayed for a week, helping Rosa recover and teaching them both how to care for the baby. Raphael was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, who kept them awake at odd hours but filled the house with new life. Zachary found himself utterly enchanted by his son, marveling at every expression, every sound, every tiny movement. Rosa recovered quickly, her natural strength serving her well, and soon she was up and moving around, though Zachary insisted she take things slowly. She would nurse Raphael in the rocking chair Zachary had brought down from the attic, singing Spanish lullabies in her sweet voice, and Zachary would watch them and feel a contentment so complete it was almost painful. As summer turned to autumn, they fell into new rhythms as a family. Zachary would carry Raphael in a sling Rosa had made while he did lighter chores around the ranch, talking to his son about the cattle, the horses, the land that would someday be his. Rosa would laugh to see them, her two men, so serious in their observations of ranch life. "He is only 3 months old," she would tease. "He does not understand about the cattle yet." "He will," Zachary would insist. "It is never too early to learn." Rosa's English was now nearly flawless, and Zachary's Spanish, while still heavily accented, was serviceable. They spoke in a comfortable mixture of both languages, often switching mid-sentence depending on which language better expressed what they wanted to say. Raphael would grow up hearing both, would be fluent in both, would be a bridge between his parents' worlds in a way they had had to build laboriously for themselves. Winter came again, their second together, but this time with the addition of Raphael. The house felt truly like a home now, filled with the sounds of a baby's cries and laughter, with tiny clothes drying by the fire, with the sweet smell of milk and talcum powder. On cold evenings, they would sit together by the fire, Rosa nursing Raphael while Zachary read aloud from his books, and the contentment Zachary felt was profound. One evening in December, as they celebrated Raphael's first Christmas, Rosa looked at Zachary with a mischievous expression. "I have something to tell you," she said. Zachary looked up from where he was playing with Raphael on the floor. "What is it?" "I think maybe Raphael will have a little brother or sister by next summer," Rosa said, her eyes dancing with amusement at his expression. Zachary's jaw dropped. "Another baby, already," Rosa laughed. "Yes, another baby. You look shocked, my Amor. Did you forget how babies are made?" Despite himself, Zachary felt heat rise to his face and Rosa laughed harder. Then he grinned and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "I am shocked, but I am happy." "So very happy." "Good," Rosa said, kissing him. "Because ready or not, our family is growing." The years that followed were full and rich. Isabella was born the following July, a dark-haired, dark-eyed beauty who had her mother's spirit and her father's stubbornness. Raphael proved to be a gentle, thoughtful child who loved the animals and spent hours following his father around the ranch. When Isabella was 2, another son arrived whom they named Samuel. 3 years after that, twin girls joined the family, Carolina and Teresa. The house that had once been so silent was now constantly filled with noise and activity. Children ran through the rooms, speaking English and Spanish interchangeably, playing games that combined both cultures. Rosa cooked Spanish dishes alongside American ones, and the children grew up appreciating both. Zachary taught them to ride, to work with cattle, to respect the land. Rosa taught them her language, her songs, her stories of Spain. The ranch prospered. Zachary expanded his herds, bought more land, hired help during the busy seasons. Rosa managed the house and garden with efficiency and grace, and somehow also found time to establish a small school in Twin Falls for children of immigrant families, teaching them English while respecting their native languages. Through it all, Zachary and Rosa remained partners. They still had their evening conversations on the porch, still taught each other new words and phrases, still marveled at how far they had come from that awkward meeting at the stagecoach station. Their love had deepened over the years, weathering the challenges of raising children, of hard winters and dry summers, of illness and loss and joy. When Raphael was 15, he asked his parents how they had managed in the early days when they could not speak to each other. They were sitting around the dinner table, the whole family gathered for Sunday supper, and the question brought a moment of thoughtful silence. "We learned patience first," Zachary said finally. "Before we could learn words, we had to learn patience." "And we learned to listen with more than ears," Rosa added. "We learned to watch faces, to feel hearts. Words are important, yes, but they are not everything." "But they are something," Zachary said, reaching across the table to take Rosa's hand. "And we worked hard to learn them. We wanted to truly know each other, not just live beside each other." "Every word was a gift we gave each other," Rosa said. "Every lesson was an act of love." Raphael nodded, understanding, and Isabella said, "I am glad you both worked so hard. Otherwise we would not be here." "That is very true," Zachary said, looking around at his children, at his wife, at the life they had built. "And I am grateful every single day that your mother took a chance on a cowboy she could not talk to." Rosa laughed. "I am grateful every day that the cowboy was patient and kind." Another man might have sent me back on the stagecoach. Never, Zachary said firmly. From the moment I saw you, I knew you were worth any challenge. The children groaned good-naturedly at their parents' sentiment, but they were smiling. They had grown up surrounded by love, by the evidence of what patience and determination and respect could build. As the children grew and eventually began lives of their own, Zachary and Rosa found themselves returning to the quiet rhythms of their early days together. Raphael took over much of the ranch work, eventually building his own house on the property when he married a schoolteacher from Twin Falls. Isabella married a banker and moved to Boise, though she visited frequently with her own children. Samuel became a lawyer and settled in Twin Falls. The twins, inseparable as always, opened a dress shop together in town. Zachary and Rosa grew older gracefully, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing, but their love remaining constant. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, still spoke in their mixture of languages, still held hands like newlyweds. They had 18 grandchildren among them, and everyone learned at least some Spanish from their grandmother and some ranching from their grandfather. On a warm evening in late summer, when Zachary was 73 and Rosa was 69, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset over the canyon, just as they had done thousands of times before. Rosa was knitting something tiny for a new great-grandchild, and Zachary was reading the newspaper, but mostly they were just enjoying each other's company. "You ever regret it?" Zachary asked suddenly. "Coming all this way, marrying a stranger, leaving everything you knew behind?" Rosa looked at him with surprise and then with tenderness. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for one single moment. This life with you has been everything I could have dreamed and more. Do you regret advertising for a bride?" "Not even for a second," Zachary replied. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Rosa Hawthorne. That stagecoach brought me everything I needed." Rosa set down her knitting and moved to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders just as he had been doing for nearly 50 years. They sat together in comfortable silence as the sky turned orange and pink and purple as the first stars emerged, as the cool evening breeze brought the scent of sage and earth. "Thank you," Rosa said quietly, "for being patient, for learning my words and teaching me yours, for building this life with me." "Thank you," Zachary replied, "for being brave enough to come and strong enough to stay and loving enough to make this house a home." They sat together until the stars filled the sky. Two people who had begun as strangers speaking different languages and had become one, united by patience, respect, and a love that had grown richer with every passing year. The ranch spread out around them, the land they had worked together, the home they had built, the family they had raised. It was a legacy of love, starting from that awkward moment at a dusty stagecoach station, when a cowboy and a Spanish woman met and decided to build a bridge between their worlds, one word at a time. Inside the house, lamplight glowed warmly through the windows. The rooms that had once echoed with children's laughter now stood quiet, but they were filled with memories. Every corner held a story, every floorboard had heard the footsteps of the family that had grown here. The cradle that had rocked 5 children sat in the attic, waiting for visits from grandchildren. The kitchen where Rosa had learned to use an American stove still smelled of the spices she had brought from Spain all those years ago. Raphael came by the next morning with his 3 oldest sons, ready to help with the fence repairs in the east pasture. He found his parents still on the porch, Zachary reading aloud from a Spanish novel while Rosa mended a tear in one of his shirts. "You two are up early," Raphael said in English, then repeated in Spanish for his mother's benefit, though she certainly understood. "Old habits," Zachary replied, setting down the book. Your mother still insists on watching the sunrise. It is the most beautiful part of the day, Rosa said. I never want to miss it. Raphael smiled at them, these parents who had given him such a rich heritage. He spoke English with his father's Idaho accent but could switch seamlessly to his mother's Castilian Spanish. His children were the same, comfortable in both worlds, products of two cultures blended into something new and beautiful. Papa, are you ready to look at those fences? Raphael asked. Ready as ever, Zachary said, standing with only a slight stiffness in his joints. He kissed Rosa's cheek. I will be back for lunch. I will make your favorite, Rosa promised. Estofado con biscuits. Raphael laughed, still mixing the languages in your cooking. It is who we are, Rosa said simply, mixed together better than separate. Zachary and Raphael rode out to the east pasture, and the morning passed in comfortable work. They spoke of the ranch, of Raphael's children, of the upcoming harvest. But Zachary's mind kept drifting back to those early days, to the feeling of helpless frustration when he could not communicate with his bride, to the slow and patient building of understanding. You know, Zachary said as they paused to drink from their canteens, I used to think the language barrier would be our biggest challenge. I worried we would never truly understand each other. But you did, Raphael said. We did, Zachary agreed. But not just because we learned each other's languages. We learned to be patient. We learned to really listen, to really pay attention. We learned that understanding goes deeper than words. Raphael nodded thoughtfully. I think that is why you and Mama have such a strong marriage. You had to work for every bit of understanding. You could not take anything for granted. That is true, Zachary said. We built our relationship deliberately, carefully, one word and one gesture and one day at a time, and I think that foundation has carried us through everything else. They worked until noon, then rode back to the house where Rosa had indeed prepared Zachary's favorite meal. Spanish beef stew served with American biscuits, a perfect representation of their blended life. The whole family gathered, as they often did on Sundays. Raphael and his wife and children, Isabella visiting from Boise with her husband and 3 youngest, Samuel driving up from Twin Falls with his family. The house was full again, ringing with laughter and conversation in 2 languages. After lunch, the grandchildren begged for stories, and Rosa told them about Spain, about the vineyard where she had grown up, about the day she decided to come to America. Zachary told them about building the ranch, about the early hard years, about the first time he saw their grandmother step down from the stagecoach. Were you scared, abuela? One of the granddaughters asked. Coming to a new place where you could not speak the language. Terrified, Rosa admitted, but also hopeful. I believed that if I worked hard and was brave, I could build a good life, and I was right. Were you disappointed, abuelo? One of the grandsons asked. When abuela could not speak English, Zachary considered this carefully. At first I was worried, but disappointed. No, your grandmother worked harder to learn than anyone I have ever known, and she taught me too. She gave me the gift of her language, her culture, her history. I am richer for it. The afternoon passed in warmth and family, and as the sun began to lower, the various families packed up to head home. Raphael was the last to leave, and he embraced both his parents tightly. Thank you, he said, for everything you built, for this family, this legacy. Thank you for being our son, Rosa said, cupping his face in her hands, for carrying forward what we started. After Raphael left, Zachary and Rosa returned to their porch, to their sunset, to the companionable silence that spoke of decades together. Zachary thought about all the sunsets they had watched from this spot, all the changes they had seen, all the challenges they had overcome. The language barrier had been just the first of many obstacles, but it had taught them the skills they would need for everything that came after: patience, creativity, determination, and above all, the willingness to meet each other halfway. "What are you thinking about?" Rosa asked, as she always did when he grew quiet. "About how lucky I am," Zachary said. "About how a woman I could not speak with became the person who understands me better than anyone in the world." Rosa smiled and laced her fingers through his. "We learned each other," she said. "Word by word, day by day, year by year. And we are still learning." "Always," Zachary agreed. As night fell over the ranch, over the canyon, over the land they had worked and loved for so long, Zachary and Rosa sat together in perfect understanding. The mail-order bride and the cowboy, the Spanish woman and the Idaho rancher, the two people who had bridged an ocean and a language barrier to find each other and build something lasting. Their story was not one of love at first sight or easy romance. It was a story of work and patience, of daily choice and commitment, of two people deciding over and over again that understanding each other was worth the effort. It was a story that began with a desperate advertisement and a brave woman's answer, and it blossomed into a love that would echo through generations. And on that warm Idaho evening, with the stars emerging overhead and the sound of the river in the distance, with 50 years of marriage behind them and whatever time remained ahead, Zachary and Rosa sat together in peace. They had learned each other's words, yes, but more importantly, they had learned each other's hearts. And that, they both knew, was the greatest language of all, the end.